Boardroom Bound, episode 148, The Importance of Human Capital and Maximizing Effectiveness in a Boardroom with Michael Haugen.
The big aha moment for me was that there was different types of problems to be solved, and there were points of leverage and points of change and impact that were far different than the plan. And one of the aha moments for me, Alexander, was that strategy without talent was not all that useful. And if you had a plan but not the team, you couldn't really go anywhere.
Hello, and welcome to this episode of Boardroom Bound. My name is Alexander Lowry, and this is the podcast dedicated to intentional leadership in the boardroom. My goal is to give aspiring and existing directors the tips, tactics, and strategies necessary to transform your confidence and build a successful career as a board director. Quick reminder, you can get all of today's show notes at podcast.gordon.edu. And in today's show, we're speaking with Michael Haugen. Michael is a former management consultant and now spent about the last 16 years working for a company called GH Smart. And you can imagine they're doing great things with talent development and acquisition. Think about CEO development, succession planning, helping the boards as well to work right with the companies and the executives. Michael's going to share some war stories with us today and some of the best practices he's seeing on the front lines of the board space as we're seeing it change so much due to COVID. Before we jump into today's show, I'd like to share a message from our sponsor about director certification. Want to join your first board, or are you looking for additional board seat opportunities? In either scenario, be sure to be disciplined in your approach. Now, through the Becoming an Exceptional Board Director Candidate Coaching and Certification course, you get both modern board director candidate packaging and modern board operations knowledge integrated within one program. Remember, the key to landing additional or your first board seat is in your packaging. Make the effort to do it right. Program graduates also receive their globally recognized International Board Director Competency designation upon course completion. It's designed for individuals and groups. You can learn more at bit.ly/IBDC-D. That's bit.ly, bit.ly/IBCDC-D. And now let's jump into the show. Michael Haugen, welcome to the Boardroom Bound podcast.
Thank you so much, Alexander, for having me.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. And of course, this started as all good networking starts in my world through my Wharton network and a dear mutual friend of ours who connected us. And it was very clear that this was going to be a wonderful episode for our show to draw upon your experience, not only in the boardroom yourself, but all the work that you are doing advising different boards of individuals and companies today. And I think this will be a really helpful session for our audience to be able to hear your brain and be alongside of you some of those conversations. But before I dive into all that fun stuff, it's really important for the audience to have the context of how you got to where you are today. So maybe if we can start some of the backstory to that, and then you can explain the business that you're in today, and we'll go from there.
Excellent. Well, thanks for asking about the backstory. You know, it's interesting in this business of working with boards and CEOs and advising. I've found that there's no true single path that gets you there. If you look across my firm, you'll see countless different stories. And so my story actually starts as being an American nomad. So I grew up in a military family. My father and both grandfathers were pilots in the Air Force, and so I moved something like 20 times in my life so far. So that brought with it some adaptability that I've had to use in the boardroom and other places, which actually is quite good to have. But I started off being more of a science and technology nerd, so looking and working in the space of chemistry of all fields in high school. So I was fortunate to go to a governor's high school for science and technology, and realized that I didn't like standing in front of a lab bench. So then I switched to engineering. When I went to undergrad, I studied chemical engineering. And most people say, "Chemie, why the heck are you a chemie in this space?" But it does make sense if we play out the rest of the story. So as a chemical engineer, I was able to join General Electric in one of their training programs back in the Jack Welch days. And that gave me an incredible experience. I started off working in a chemical plant making plastic, and through my 4-job rotation, I ended up as a field salesperson in Chicago. And so I went from kind of the deeply engineering inside a high secure plant all the way out to working with customers and being kind of an advisor and technical sales rep to large companies all over the Midwest. So that trajectory was one of wanting to solve problems. I've always been a problem solver, but instead of just solving the problems inside the plant, I was now solving problems at other people's locations for the many varied customers we had at GE Plastics. And then I realized I now found myself in the commercial world, or the dark side, as my engineering friends called it, and I had no real training. So on what business was, what commercial even meant. So I ended up applying to business schools as a way to learn business. It was kind of just a big open field for me. And ended up choosing our alma mater there back at Penn. So I had a great time going to Wharton for the 2 years. Really found great people, great insights, great professors, great classes, and ended up studying strategy and also entrepreneurship. And then got picked up with the Boston Consulting Group. So I saw BCG as kind of the postdoctorate of the MBA as a way just to experience tons of different companies, some of which we actually have in common, and really help them with their strategy issues. So that was another form of problem solving for me, was now focusing on company strategy, and that was just a lot of fun. I ended up staying for a couple of consulting lifetimes, so I ended up staying for almost 7 years. And then the big aha moment for me was that there was different types of problems to be solved, and there were points of leverage and points of change and impact that were far different than the plan. And one of the aha moment for me, Alexander, was that strategy without talent was not all that useful. And if you had a plan but not the team, you couldn't really go anywhere. So I started to see the issue of human capital at the executive level as being something that was very important. Now, right as I decided to not focus on BCG and go off and do something else rather than stand for election, a young man named Jeff Smart came along, and our firm, GH Smart, is the initials and the last name of Jeffrey Hudson Smart, our founder and chairman. And he said there actually is a field that is doing this executive kind of optimization at the C-suite, helping companies run as well as they can, helping solve problems at the CEO space and the board, and really being the trusted advisor to making those really tough decisions that play in this arena. And that was well over 15 years ago. So now I find myself as one of the more tenured people in our firm, and just having a great time working on, helping, serving on boards to make sure that they do the right things and meet their objectives.
And so let's take that to a high level, Michael. That's a fantastic context. And I'm sure there are a couple words that sort of popped out at people listening, thinking about a board. And strategy is one of those things. And if you haven't landed in your first board seat, even if you have, right, there's probably a sense of like, I think I know what I'm going to be doing. And we're going to be at the 30,000 foot level, coming all these amazing ideas, and someone's going to run away and implement them. It can be a bit of a shock when you first land in there and you go, whoa, it wasn't really what I expected there. So help us take that idea that we all have of what the strategy sounds like in a boardroom, what it actually looks and feels like in that space.
Yeah, and that's being a former strategy consultant. We joke that there's so many different meanings of the word strategy. Is it little s strategy, which is really about executing a plan? Is it big S, kind of greenfield, broad space strategy? And I think that variation of what strategy means is also seen in the boardrooms for where the board plays or doesn't play in strategic elements of running an organization. So one of the things that we've talked about prior, Alexander, is just the great variety of boards and styles and approaches. And I would say if you think that coming into a board, you're going to be sitting there talking only the highest level elements all of the time, not probably actually what you're going to see. Some boards I've seen be incredibly detail-oriented. Some boards I've seen be basically a rubber stamp, which I never say is a good board. And other boards are somewhere in between. I would say most are somewhere in between. The whole classic expression of kind of, noses in, fingers out, which is kind of, I think, public company board ethos, most of the time works. But in terms of strategy, you're going to see strategies presented to you as a board. You may be asked for input, but bringing up kind of greenfield ideas as a board member and thinking that's where the ideas are going to come from, I just haven't seen that happen as often in my board interactions.
And what's really interesting about that is that it'll vary so much depending on, say, not only the industry you're in and maybe the companies within it, whether you're talking public or private. So it's hard to generalize around this, but we do know without a doubt, strategy will be something, depending on where you are, perhaps on what committee you're on, you are expected to bring good thoughts, whether it's you have worked in a certain industry or the connections that you have. everyone is supposed to bring their best practice ideas, whether even just healthy challenging of what management has brought up. So, Michael, in some instances, I'm sure you
Exactly.
work the organization where the CEO has gone away either himself or with some very important consulting company and come back with this wonderful binder of like, we've figured out what we should be doing. We wanted to bring it to you guys for feedback or rubber stamping, whatever the case might be. Talk us through those sorts of scenarios and help the board members realize, okay, where is my job? Let's pretend they have a fiduciary role and how they should be thinking about this and positioning themselves.
Yeah, it's an excellent point, Alexander. I would say it's almost, I'm an executive coach, so I coach CEOs around the world. And one of the most powerful tools of a coach is the powerful question. It's thinking through what are the things that need to be uncovered, what are the points that you need to poke and probe, what are the second and third order implications that may be out there that could either be upsides or downsides, and really making sure those things are clear. So I think as a board member coming in, first of all, reading the materials. I've seen boards and worked with boards that got all of the board pack out a week in advance. I've seen boards where it's been an hour before the board meeting. Clearly, giving directors time to have the time to read is hugely important. But I would say, read the materials, think about the powerful questions. I know a bunch of board members, and kind of in my role on the nonprofit board that I serve on, is I ask a powerful question that I believe will drive the conversation, but I'm also doing it to help poke and probe and kick the tires a bit. Because if I get the feeling that the question is answered well, it's been thought through, there's other scenarios and implications, then I'm going to feel more comfortable and kind of move forward. If I kick the tires and the bumper falls off, then that's something where clearly, as a board member, you want to dig more.
Now, I suppose the I don't know, somewhat chaos some board members would probably be telling me over the last 18 months that we've all been living through with COVID, how the world has changed. And the greatest strategy documents that we had from 2 years ago were in many cases not prepared for some of these scenarios. It has been an opportunity for people to be bringing their different thinking, their different mindsets. Some of it is very tactical. How do we survive? What do we do until the situation changes versus, oh, the world has really shifted, whether it's supply chain or talent management, whatever it might be. And Michael, I'm sure you're in the midst of some of these organizations now rethinking how should we be structured, how should we be spending our time, how should we physically be getting together if we do, and that is changing a lot of what boards are doing, at least how they're going about doing it. Talk us through what you're seeing on the ground these days.
Yeah, so I'd love to maybe take a slightly different tack, Alexander, based off of this, and maybe if this is relevant, tell me. If not, then we can re-ask the question. One of the most fascinating things I've seen in the board space and in just in leadership in general, and GH Smart is a leadership advisory, is the fact of how different leaders have stepped up or not during the pandemic. This was really prevalent, during the first number of months back in the spring into early summer of last year in 2020. But I would say that, some leaders stuck their heads in the sand and hoped all of this would go away. Others, looked forward and said, we'll just keep doing what we do. Others radically changed everything. And others, stepped into the spaces that those people with their head in the sand left. I would say, one of our values at GH Smart is if in doubt, lead. And I think as a director, you would see and have seen across this time different leaders acting and reacting in different ways. This has informed not only who the people are that can really handle the stress and the changes and the great, lack of clarity of the world, but also who might be able to step up and maybe go even further than you would have expected in the traditional talent review. What we talk about when we do professional assessments is that, theoretical questions lead to theoretical answers, and that's how a lot of interviews are done. And I think that in this space, the theory of how would someone step into a more challenging position, the environment of the pandemic allowed people to do that. It was almost a live fire exercise. And you saw from the board level and the executive level, people that you thought would be amazing. People that you thought would be amazing fall apart. And it's really been an opportunity to kind of reevaluate talent and to think about talent for the future. So that's been one of the most fascinating aspects. And I would say that's not just in the beginning of the pandemic, but as you mentioned, return to work, all the various issues of social justice reform and everything else that's happened since March of 2020 have really helped stress and strain and pressure test the leadership and board structures of a lot of companies in a way that is really powerful, painful, but also at the end productive if you take the time to look and understand what's been going on.
Michael, this is such a valuable conversation. So let's continue this. So, at some point in this soon, I'm going to park it for now. We'll talk about sort of CEO and the C suite leadership and the management because the board has a role to play there, especially with the CEO. But let's just take it for the board level at the moment. So, you and I have worked with lots of Fortune 500 companies. They often have a very
Hmm.
robust review and performance processes for their staff. What is an odd thing I continually find again and again, and more people I talk to, it seems to be so normal that the board does not operate in the same way. We often do not give ourselves reviews, whether it's as a collective board or as individuals. And we can talk about why that might be, because you might lose your very good board seat that was very hard to get. But this is an opportunity, like you've talked about, you realize, wow, I've seen my colleagues in a different way. And maybe you're getting a better sense of what this board needs, what this company needs, who you are, therefore how you fit. Help us think through this as leaders sitting around the boardroom for ourselves as a unit, for the company that we're setting helping direction for. How do we improve and never waste a crisis?
Yeah, so I think that's Rahm Emanuel who quoted others about them never let a good crisis go to waste,
Mm-hmm.
which was actually a quote I was going to say a moment ago, but thank you for bringing it back up. I would say in these situations, especially if you see things within the board, this is one of the reasons why, as a new board member, it's very important to start building relationships on the board. I would say if whoever the chairperson is or the independent lead director, whatever the specific governance is of the board, is really understand what's the communication channel, what are the expectations for each director, how does the power flow around the board, and if you have a recommendation such as, we've done this great board review, how come the only people that gave input were board members and not management, which is a conversation I had in the last number of weeks with a CEO, and think about, who would you actually talk to about this? Would it be something you could openly bring up in an open board session? Is it something where you could go to the lead director or the chairperson and say, "Hey, I think we need to do this"? And if you understand, how to effectively influence and drive change, you can take that observation that you have and do it correctly. I think one of the things a lot of new directors do is kind of keep things quiet into themselves until they've had a few board meetings or crises or whatever else under their belt before they speak up. And I would argue that, if you're of the caliber of being on, especially a large public company board, your value, your kind of ability to bring value should be there from the beginning. So don't, stay silent. Don't be a jerk about it. But at the same time, understand how things are done and have the leadership courage to bring up where those issues might be.
I would agree. People are recruited for a specific skill set or sets that they are bringing, and they need that from day one. And Michael, you hinted about this before, so I'd love to draw this now. So imagine someone that was brought onto boards. I've got great stories from friends of mine who were brought onto boards during this crisis. It's been a wonderful trial by fire for them, and they've been up to speed a lot faster than they perhaps would have been otherwise. But imagine the board has to go through that sort of forming, storming, norming process. And they had a traditional way they
Mm-hmm.
did that in the past. They got together X amount of times per year. You'd have the dinner beforehand. You got to know people. That's been very different now. There's some boards that have still only gotten together by Zoom at this point, and that can be harder to build those relationships. But you were hinting in the beginning of you need to really understand the political currents that are happening in the boardroom, what your board is like, how the relationships work. So in addition to becoming a very coherent and cogent team that can make important decisions in a very short period of time, especially as we've seen in the last 18 months, what are your sort of observations of the course of your career and the guidance that you're giving people of how do they help each other to become the best leaders that they can be?
I think one thing is just talk to each other. So it's exactly right what you just said, Alexander, is that a lot of the kind of most impactful elements of board meetings, at least in relation to director interactions, happen in outside the actual formal board meeting. It's those dinners, it's the, going to the airport together, it's, catching a drink, a coffee or otherwise, that where the real kind of people feel relaxed and able to speak up. And the pandemic has been, a test to us all. But I would say that the loss of that person-to-person interaction, the loss of the ability to have some of those less formal and more intimate conversations, has made that very, very challenging. The best boards that I've seen have worked very hard to not fully remove those intimate conversations. They've actually had virtual cocktail parties. They've actually had, directors or say chairs or lead independent directors that reach out and actually have less formal conversations. They've actually had, new board members that they've come on that where the onboarding has not just been here's how we work, but let us actually, walk you through how things work on this board, not to limit, not to say like fall in line with our structure, but just to give you the heads up. I'd say anytime you come into a new leadership role, be it on the board or otherwise, you should take the opportunity and force yourself to do the map of the organization, who you need to know, where the power centers are, where the influencers are, where you can have value, how they like to act. And doing all of those same things at the board level is really, really important. Again, COVID's made it harder, but I would say it's not impossible. And then more recently, now that we're looking into here, into the October, I believe we're here at October 2021, there's a lot of boards that are starting to have those sessions again. They're starting to get back in person. And it's just kind of a relief for everybody to have those conversations in a way that's not as forced, that's more natural. But for the organizations that have not yet come back together, I think all directors need to ensure that they're forming those and keeping and building those intimate bonds that will actually lead towards more open conversation and ultimately more productivity at the board level.
I agree with all of that. And the other thing, it's always hard to extrapolate the best practice advice. I'm sure you've found the same thing. I've never found any board that's exactly like the others, whether they're public or private or nonprofit,
Exactly.
industry. Everybody is a unique, special snowflake in and to themselves. They have different ways of doing things. And so when someone is starting on a board, finding how do you take the time to truly understand the approach, the style, and the character of the board. And I'm sure you've seen instances where that has gone well and perhaps not as well. What is the advice you're giving us? When we were talking about this before, you were saying some people have set back and they've been reticent to be involved in the beginning. What's your best practice advice for someone really starting into this role and really wanting to knock it out of the park?
So first off, I would say do all of your research. So this is more of a meta point, Alexander, is that I've seen too many people swing at the first pitch when it comes to jumping on boards. I've seen people that have ended up on boards where they had the offer because it was something they've worked very hard to get on a board. But then they took the offer without realizing, is this an industry that I'm really passionate about? Does the style of the board and the other directors resonate with my own personal style? Not to say groupthink, but to say, can stylistically I align? Is this a situation where the chairperson leads by just iron will, and we're all here to just nod and say yes? So the first thing I'd say is do your diligence. Don't necessarily swing at the first pitch, and make sure that kind of you're really understanding what's going on in the boards before you join. I know it's a painful process a lot of the times, but making sure you get on the right board is as important, if not more important, I would say, than getting on a board. So that's one point. The other point I would say is that, making sure that you do a good onboarding, just like you would if you were stepping into a C-suite role, learning about the company, getting analyst reports, talking to the rest of the organization, meeting with your other directors and management team members. As somebody who is a consultant that advises boards, we, in those situations, we help onboard the board members from our point of view. And I would say if you're working with a strategy shop like, BCG, my old colleague, or my old employer, I would say meet with their senior partner, that's whoever it is that's leading your account. So, because they're going to see things differently. They're going to have, as you and I have, a view of a lot of different boards, and that relative viewpoint versus the absolute viewpoint of somebody who maybe is only on that other board is going to be very highly valuable. So I'd say, do your diligence, understand the situation, chart things out, and really think about, as you mentioned very much relevantly at the beginning, what's your value prop and where do you want to have the most impact?
Right. And fortunately, when you have that partner conversation, you can pull out a napkin and draw a 2x2 grid on the back, and it'll tell you all the problems of the company, how it fits into that one little page, and you'll be all set. Now, that's glib, of course.
I was going to say, one of my favorite interactions when I was at BCG was I was just about to interview a very senior leader of a very large business. And I sat down to start the conversation, and the individual walked up to their whiteboard, drew a 2x2 out, said, "Okay, now we can start. I know how you BCG people work." It was just hilarious. And that little bit of humor at the beginning of the conversation actually, I think, accelerated, our ability to be impactful with each other just through the use of humor.
Right. Well, Michael, I love where you're going into the C-suites here. Let's take the conversation there. So if you're a board member, wherever you might think it lands, but definitely within your top three, the CEO nurturing process. So you might be finding the CEO, walking through them with their journey while they are the CEO, potentially replacing them for a variety of reasons. That is definitely one of the things that you're doing. And you work on both sides of that, if I can call it that. You're helping boards in that whole process, but you're also working with CEOs, whether it's coaching them, developing them, guiding them, perhaps preparing people to move from a different C-suite role into a CEO role. Help people better understand all the pressures and the complexity and how, as a board member, they can do their best job to be in support of the CEO.
Yeah, it's an excellent point. If I could do a little shameless plug, we actually have a book called The CEO Next Door, which was published in 2018, which explores like what makes for an effective CEO. So I think part of it is just understanding as a board member, like what are the really key traits that it takes to be an effective chief executive officer, and also what are the common on and off ramps, like what are the things that are distractions, what are landmines that new CEOs trip over. One of those, by the way, is not forming the right type of relationship with your board from the outset. And we can go into much more depth on that one. But I would say thinking about CEOs, especially new CEOs, realize that most CEOs, if it's their first time in the seat, a lot of people think that as CEO, I don't really have a boss. I can kind of do what I want. And then they get in and they realize, wait, the board is my boss, and they're going to really hold me accountable. And wait, these board members are really powerful, capable, experienced, and highly opinionated, and usually fairly decent ego individuals. And now part of my job is to manage them. So that whole give and take, the feeling each other out, kind of making sure that you build productive relationships with high rapport, and really ideally open two-way communication is super important. So as a board member, I would say lean into being open to a CEO, especially if you're a new board member or new CEO, talking about your style and their style, what works and what doesn't. Thinking about what role you can play and where you can be helpful to them. I think those are all just good hygiene in general as a senior leader. But I would say some directors I've seen and CEOs I've seen expect that you don't have to have those conversations, or that's below you if you have those types of conversations at the C-suite and the board. And I would say the opposite is true. I believe they're even more important because you need to make sure you have that really productive, open relationship. You want to make sure that if you ever have to break glass because something's really bad is happening, that is not the time to start forming a relationship. You want to make sure you have a relationship that helps you navigate those types of challenges, and they will happen sometime in your tenure, both on the board or the C-suite. And doing that diligence, investing, making sure that you have that relationship there is hugely important.
Michael, you've covered so much ground there. Let's pick up on one little thing. If you're a CEO, there's definitely a list, at least in your head, of what's keeping you up at night. That might vary over time, but there are probably a couple of potential nightmare scenarios. And one might be your board relationship, what you're talking about there. You might have a certain type of board member that perhaps we talked about the nose in, fingers out before, that if you're a new board member, that is a really hard thing to do, from being the operator in the C-suite to no longer being the operator in a boardroom. And especially in your first role, it's pretty easy to stray over that line. You're trying to figure out how that works. You're developing into a new role yourself. And if you're the CEO, you're trying to figure out how to establish those boundaries, maintain those boundaries. Help us understand from the CEO's perspective. You will undoubtedly have coached some of them through this process of, I don't want to say put a board member back in their box, but help them understand what that role is. Help us as board members to realize, oh, this is where I should be going. I should not go over this red line.
So it's fascinating that this ties together with the point that you mentioned earlier, Alexander, which is about board feedback. There is a lack of really good open feedback at the board level, at the C-suite level in general. People are just not comfortable saying what they really feel, or they try to smooth it over so much or make it so politically palatable that it just is, really diluted. And I would say as the CEO, especially with your chair or your lead independent, making sure that you talk about, what are the boundaries? Like, where are you going to play? Where am I going to play? What are we going to do when we have to give each other very hard feedback? As a CEO coach and board advisor, I actually find myself often having to be, and the people in my firm also who play these very important roles, we find ourselves being the nexus of communication between the C-suite and the board. And our goal is to make it so that we're not that. We want to make sure those open communications happen. But what I've found, Alexander, is that, and this may be kind of against what might be common thinking, the really capable lead directors and chairs and very powerful board people that I know, they want feedback. They've mostly been in the C-suite, or they've led an organization, or been a managing partner, or whatever their special background is. And most people in those positions are starving for authentic feedback. We call the CEO suite within our firm the loneliest seat in corporate America, because no one's really willing to tell you what's going on and what you're doing right or wrong. And it's kind of the emperor's clothes risks happening in that situation. So I would say lead with authenticity if you're the CEO and you have to give hard feedback. Pre-wire as much as possible and get acceptance, almost to the point of saying, hey, Madam Chairperson, when I have something really hard to say, I would love to have your permission just to say it. And before you have any content or any need to pull that trigger, asking for that permission not only helps set the stage for that communication later, it also reminds you as CEO or whatever leadership role you're in that it is part of your job to have those tough conversations. Leadership courage means ignoring your comfort or discomfort and doing what's right.
I love that. And Michael, I'm going to harken back to something you mentioned at the beginning about how you'd moved so many times being a military child. When I think about sort of senior military
my
officers.
wife likes to say military brat.
There you go. I didn't want to say it, but I agree with it. That's a term I hear all the time. When I think about it that way, you think about like the colonels talking to the general. It's like, sir, permission to speak freely. Can I really tell you what's going on, what's thinking? And they'll say yes or no. So they actually have the ability to give that there, which doesn't necessarily always exist in the corporate world the same way. So I love the way you said that. And Michael, time has been flying here, but I want to make sure we carve out a few minutes at the end. You are spending so much time working with the CEOs and the board members. Things have been changing so fast. As you look into the crystal ball and you peer ahead, I'd love to hear any thoughts that you have about the future of the boardroom and how the relationships might be changing we've been talking about today.
Yeah, so I'll do another book plug here. Ram Charan and a number of other authors wrote a book in the last couple of years called Talent Wins. And one of the core theses that I really agree with is that there's kind of the three-headed lead of all companies, or what should be theoretically the lead of all companies. And I think it is, they say the CEO, which is what most people commonly think about, the CFO, which clearly is, making sure that the lifeblood of the business is flowing with capital and fiduciary oversight. And then the CHRO, the person that's leading the talent side. And I'm incredibly biased on this just because it's my business. But I would say that's really true. The reason I left BCG in the first place to come into this field was because I saw a lack of leadership courage, the lack of ability of senior people to make those difficult decisions. And I would say the war for talent has gotten harder and harder. In the pandemic, everyone thought, there'll be this excess of talent. But I would say the opposite actually has been true, as we've seen, especially, recently as, things are opening back up and people are realizing what's important to them and where they want to go and moving out into different roles. And so thinking about what does that mean for the board of the future, we believe that you should have more of a leadership view, that you should think about talent more as a board member. One of the analogies that I like to make now and then that our firm has been pushing is that the talent review that a board does, there's ongoing feedback to the CEO because that's part of your remit. But when you think about the talent review, it's typically a once a year on the board calendar. The CEO and potentially CHRO will walk through and say, here's the senior team. Here's who's ready now for succession in case of emergency. Here's the people maybe ready in a couple of years. So what you're getting there through that once a year review is really a balance sheet. You're getting a single point in time static view of how something is at one instant. So one of the thoughts that we have just to help prompt this importance of talent across organizations is that you would never manage the finances of a business through a balance sheet. Right. There's other things that you need to look at. There's, in the traditional, thinking about the financial statements that are out there with all public companies, is, there's cash flows and there's income statement. And, we would argue that you need to, as a board member, think about those things from the talent side as well. What are, the cash flows is like talent flow. Who are people moving in and out of the business and why? Are you a net talent attractor or are you as talent fleeing? And having that view as a board member is very important. The income statement, the equivalent here is matching up the strategy and the actions with the individuals who are responsible for executing them. do you actually have the best people on the most mission critical aspects of your plan? We've done analyses in organizations where we mapped out the strategy, the linked actions, and then who is responsible for it. And sometimes you find that basically some of these actions have been passed down the org to people who aren't really able to do it. Or what you see even more commonly is that all of these key activities are given to one or two or three individuals that are responsible for basically everything, because it's the whole homage of like, if you need something done, give it to a busy person. So all of that is to say board members need to think about talent and human capital as much as they do fiscal capital.
Michael, I love that, and I'm glad to see that we are seeing the seeds of that change over time from the pandemic. I'm seeing more chief HR officers getting put onto boards as people recognize that. So that's great advice for all of us. And we were delighted to have you on the show today. Thank you for sharing your insights and helping all of us to be boardroom bound. That's it for this episode of Boardroom Bound. I really enjoyed chatting with Michael Haugen. Fantastic stories that he's experiencing on the front line, working with boards, working with CEOs, helping them figure out how to change and grow and develop, not only as individuals, as a company, but during all the crisis we've seen going on for the last 18 months. Now remember, if you head over to podcast.gordon.edu, you will find links to all of today's resources. And please know that the Boardroom Bound team and I are so proud to be your go-to podcast for all things that connect, prepare, and empower you to land a board seat. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast so you'll miss any of the high-quality content that we're bringing to you every Wednesday. Thanks for joining me today. I can't wait to share more stories and strategies from brilliant business minds with you again next week. Remember to keep tuning in to be Boardroom Bound.